Of the Elizabeth Seton Lectures for this year, which marks the 20th anniversary of this lecture series. My name is Paul Boudette, and I'm a member of the Religious Studies Department here at the Mount. It's mostly through the work of my colleagues, Jacques Goulet and Randy Warren, as well as along with the help of Phoebe Smith, that this event is coordinated. And due to the forethought and generosity of the Sisters of Charity of the Halifax province, that its continuance is assured. It's my pleasure and privilege this morning to introduce this year's speaker, Dr. Michael Higgins, the Dean and Vice President of St. Jerome's College in Waterloo, Ontario, and most recently President-elect. Those of you who heard him speak last night can attest to his energy, his breadth of vision, as well as his experience, and the delightful richness of his articulation. I'd also like to mention at this point that he has just come out with a book called Heretic Blood, The Spiritual Geography of Thomas Merton. It's just been released, and it's available from Stoddard Publishers. And so it's an interpretation of the life of Thomas Merton. So I invite you to join me in welcoming Michael this morning as he shares with us his thoughts on religion and the Canadian media, the mouse that roared.
Thank you, Paul, and welcome back. At this regimen, the mouse won't be moving at all by the end of the day. One lecture last night and then the first thing in the morning, and actually it took me a while to find my way here. I kept walking around the building. It seemed like a metaphor for my intellectual processes. Constantly trying to find a room here, a room there. By the time I eventually encountered Jacques Goulet, I told him that I had already given the lecture in a different auditorium, and then now I was ready for lunch. What is most depressing in all this, of course, he didn't seem surprised by it. This morning's lecture, part 2, Through a Glass Darkly, my one major indebtedness to St. Paul, is the examination of the role of Canadian media, the screen, and its relation to religion. As we looked at last night, talking most particularly about the foundations and then moving on to looking specifically at radio, what I want to do this morning is examine this in relation to the television screen, but also cinema. And I'm going to talk about documentaries, and I'm going to talk about media coverage of religious issues in the context of Canadian television, most certainly, but as I indicated last night, we need to have a yardstick by which to measure Canadian, the quality of Canadian work and the signature of Canadian work by looking at American and British television as well. And that's what we'll continue to do today. In a very interesting article in his column, yesterday I referred to Fulford's Wednesday column in the Globe and Mail. Today I'm referring to Rick Salutin's column on Friday, which is actually titled Media, not the more generic Observer. Salutin has an interesting background. He was a rabbinical seminarian, has worked in the media all his life, and is a thoughtful and philosophically inclined journalist. In other words, you don't find a great number of them working in the tabloids and on the broadsheets of any country. He's skilled, he's highly competent, and he's particularly interested in the theological and philosophical undercurrents of what happens. He opens up for examination readily, sometimes breathtakingly, the unspoken, unconscious presuppositions that operate in culture at large. In short, he's not just a journalist, he is also a cultural critic. Now, I don't wish you to think in any way that I'm being negative about journalists here. I intend not to be, and I hope that I'm not. As I indicated last night, in part, I'm an amateur journalist myself, so I have some respect, indeed, quite considerable respect, for the profession. But what I am saying is that very much in journalism, one finds an increasingly careful delineation or specialization creeping in which prevents some journalists from allowing themselves to exercise the greater kind of intellectual survey and penetration that you find in critics like Salutin, and I think to some degree in Robert Fulford as well. In his column called, this one particularly, "God May Be in the Details, but He's Hard to Find on TV," Salutin makes the following observation, and I quote, "We are into another pious period in the media, and not just because Christmas is coming." This was last Christmas. "There's the tumult about the United Church and Jesus, including Maclean's current cover, 'Is Jesus Really God?' And there's what Toronto Star media writer Antonia Zerbisias calls an astonishing surge in spiritually inspired series on TV like Touched by an Angel." Okay, it's not all tremendously thoughtful. 96% of Americans may believe in God, but 1 in 10 also think Joan of Arc was Noah's wife. "Is Jesus divine or not?" barked Michael Harris at the Reverend Bruce MacLeod on CTV's Sunday edition. Harris might have at least said what he means by little words like Jesus and divine, or even the is for that matter. As for Touched by an Angel, one reviewer says she feels like she's watching The Littlest Hobo. A cute being scampers around, helps people out, and moves on. It has angel jokes about frequent flyer points, plus backlit hair and heavenly choirs. But I wonder how much shows like it have to do with religion at all. So Roseanne and other stars are into the Kabbalah, the Jewish mysticism, this week and wear red bracelets. How different is that, really, from playing the lottery and reading your horoscope? And then Salutin concludes rather pointedly, what, in fact, makes this stuff religious? But surely that's the point we alluded to yesterday. The difficulty of defining what is, in fact, religious content on television. If we leave it to the producers to define what is religious content, we often get, in fact, the trivialization of religious symbols and religious metaphors. More often than not, we get cutesy religion, not serious religion. Religion on television often, particularly if it's generated by Hollywood and its subsidiaries, often has to rely upon immediately identifiable icons. So nuns always wear habits, or mostly do, in sharp contrast with the ecclesial world since the Second Vatican Council. There is a clerical type which actually predates 1962 to 1965, the years of the Council, and what one discovers again and again, in Roman Catholicism particularly, but not exclusively, a dangerous ahistorical approach to religious symbols. The problem is that it all becomes rather meaningless. It's simply backdrop. This is the nun, this is the priest. As you may notice from various television programs, it is impossible, it seems, for producers to distinguish between a monk and a friar. Everything becomes rather collapsed into the same. It's religion as backdrop. It's religion as instant comedy or cuteness. Somehow or other, it's been safely sanitized. In short, it's been commodified. In a splendid talk given by Mark Starowitz, you may know him, he's a senior producer with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and was the creator of the CBC's Journal. He also was involved in establishing several other programs on CBC radio, including As It Happens in the 1970s, Morningside. He has a long history of particularly established and inventive television programming. In a rather significant talk given about a year ago, Starowitz points directly in contrasting public broadcasting with commercial broadcasting with how they relate to the religious topic per se, and what are the principal predicators involved in determining exactly what it is that we are to see. Let me quote directly from this address. Starowitz argues, only those shows get produced which generate the viewers which the advertisers want. The commercial system is totally product-driven. So television interacts only with those groups which have attained a significant buying power. If you do not have significant buying power, then on the whole your stories, your fears, and your hopes, and your children are not a part of this visual metropolis. You don't have to be poor or on welfare. You can be old. You can be empty nesters, scaling down your expenditures. By television value standards, you are only marginal. I think you can add to this religion. Television is a visual mall, a visual shopping mall. There are stores for people who have money to spend. There's the Gap for one niche. There's Woco for another. There's a Crabtree and an Evelyn for another group, a Disney store for still another, an HMV for one more. And television is about as democratic as a shopping mall. There is only a store for your needs if you fit a demographic income group large enough to justify a store. Our shopping malls are certainly fascinating windows on our society, but they are hardly complete reflections of our society. By nature, then, television reflects back to the audience the values of those demographic groups. Commercial television does not challenge. In fact, it simply cannot. Commercial television reflects back the attitudes of the audience that it serves. Now, that's not a deficiency of the system, argues Starowitz. That's the whole point of the system. It is a medium, television, of consensus. It will show gays and lesbians after, only after, a broad social consensus has been achieved. David Halberstrom called it the cheering section for the side which has had already won. End of quote. And Starowitz goes on and provides a quite penetrating analysis, as I say, of the difference between public and commercial broadcasting in relation to not only the demographics, but the very real power of the advertisers over the producers. Well, what does that mean in the context of religion, then? Where do religious groups stand in this demographic mosaic? What role or power or influence do individual religious groups have in order to demand of television that it be a visual mall that also allows them to see their product, in fact? Well, I think the answer to some of those questions is rather clear. Religion, of course, is highly diverse. Many people, as we indicated yesterday from the Southern Global Poll, would indicate that they may not define themselves as particularly religious. We continue to lament the seemingly irreversible decline in worship practices, and yet we marvel, statisticians, scholars, and others, by the fact that the interest in religion has not only not abated, it continues almost relentlessly. In fact, as we indicated yesterday, people prefer not to talk about religion, but indeed to talk about spirituality. There is a danger, semantically, in making such a case, but one can also see what is happening clearly enough. No doubt how one wants to describe it, religion is with us, / spirituality is not likely to go away. Well, how then do we get a reasonable hearing? In many ways, talking about the details, just look at some of the news broadcasting that deals with an event and gets it wrong. Let me give you a sad example from the Toronto area of fairly recent vintage. Recently, a police officer, Bill Hancock, was killed in Toronto. There was a great outpouring of grief over his death, quite reasonably. Hancock was, in fact, a devout member of his local Anglican communion, his local church. And it was startling to see on all the Toronto networks how the local priest was called upon again and again and spoke in an articulate, passionate, and accessible way. They were sound bites that seemed to matter. They were sound bites that were sensitive. And yet on the actual day of his funeral, in which pretty well all the cameras of all the networks were concentrated on this event, it was extraordinary by any measure, reporters continued to get the simplest details wrong. One reporter from Global TV, in fact, had a knack for getting all of it wrong. Now, it may seem minor in a way, but it's not. Let me give you an example. He was to be buried out of his own local church, St. Dunstan of Canterbury. The church, however, was too small to accommodate the large numbers that would be there. So they moved the church to the Roman Catholic church, St. Isaac Jogues. Now, the Global TV reporter continued to refer to St. Dunstan, Canterbury, and St. Isaac of Jogues. Well, it seems like a minor thing, but it's not. Would you get Premier Mike of Harris? Not very likely. The care that should be taken to make sure that this is right is sometimes, it seems to me, more in theory and in anticipation than it is in fact. But to lament that alone might seem a little, if not snide, certainly disproportionate. So let's put it in its larger context again. I've quoted already from Mark Starowitz on public television in the electronic revolution. Let me now quote from Antonia Zerbisius, herself is quoting Robert J. Thompson, a scholar at Syracuse University, talking about the comparative differences between public broadcasting and commercial broadcasting. I want to establish this fairly firmly before we go on to look specifically at some of the programming. Thompson, who in fact is the director of the Center for the Study of Popular Television at Syracuse University, made the following observation to the media columnist of the Toronto Star, Antonia Zerbisius. He said, and I quote, "In the United States, pop culture is so pervasive that the idea of actually putting it under a magnifying glass doesn't even occur to people. We certainly don't get any sense of a critical perspective. For the most part, our programs about popular culture are all hot air." I suggest to you that in terms of programs that have a religious backdrop or a seemingly religious context, Touched by an Angel, Nothing Sacred, do exactly the same thing. Thompson goes on further to observe, and I quote, "We have this really poor environment of intellectually coming to grips with the culture that we consume at an incredible rate. I think that that's never healthy in any society, to be so oblivious to this thing that surrounds us daily." And then goes on to observe, by conclusion, that public television, PBS in the United States, obviously, and National Public Radio, but particularly he was referring to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, makes all the difference in the world. It allows for a freer exchange of ideas because it doesn't always have to appeal to advertisers and to always be so incredibly popular. Let's face it, a serious critique of the media would never survive on a big-time network. Your system in Canada is much, much healthier. End of quote. Now, as a matter of course, I happen to think that Thompson is entirely right. Okay? But I'm not here to defend public broadcasting per se, or indeed the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. They have their own flaws, clearly. But what Thompson was observing is that the commercial networks just simply do not have the latitude, the maneuverability, to do the kind of serious intellectual critiquing that he feels television is capable of doing for all kinds of factors that control, factors that don't exist in the public broadcasting world. Now, of course, in Canada, we have this strange hybrid in that we have public broadcasting that actually is commercial broadcasting. So our television network, in fact, does have advertising. It is, in fact, our radio network, Radio 1 and Radio 2, that are, in fact, genuinely the public broadcaster. So the reality is a little more complicated than perhaps Thompson allows. But it nonetheless still speaks to the fact, as I think we had some indication last night from a couple of the questions, that public television in Canada, even in its commercial guise, is likely to be more testing, more dangerous, more temerarious than its American or British equivalents like Sky or ITV or Granada. So what are we looking for in religious themes and religious topics and religious coverage as opposed to, quotation marks, religious broadcasting on television? And why should we look for it? Joe Sinasak, who is the editor of the Catholic Register in Toronto and the former foreign affairs editor of the Kitchener-Waterloo Record, and somebody who has a fair bit of experience in the secular as well as the religious media, was observing at a conference at which Andrew Grenville from one of the large polling firms in Canada was giving a paper. He did a kind of condensed critique of this information. Now, it's fairly lengthy, and I don't intend at all to read it, but I'm going to take one paragraph from it because it's an interesting and quite reasonably succinct and accurate summary of the wealth of statistical detail that posters love. And it pertains and is relevant to our discussion this morning. Sinasak says of Grenville's work, the poster, the percentage of Canadians believing in God remains in the mid-80s, dropping only slightly from the low 90s a half-century ago. More significantly, 64% of those surveyed by the Angus Reid poll have felt God's presence in their lives. 64%. The same percentage believe God cares about them personally. The same percentage believe in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and that the Bible is the inspired Word of God. 64%. 60% say their Christian beliefs help them to understand their day-to-day lives. Almost half of Canadians pray weekly. And then we have this interesting quotation from Grenville, which again, statistically is right, but places it in context. More people read the Bible every day than read the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star, or watch CTV News or the CBC News. So in fact, the point that Sinasak and Grenville are making is that religion, although looking at its coverage through the national media, might appear to be an interesting divertissement for a small group of people, an affectation, kind of decorative reality for some, is in fact substantive, is in fact constitutive of the culture. And so that TV and media coverage of religion is significantly disproportionate to the fact that religion continues to play a critical, for a significant number, the critical determinative in defining their lives, in giving meaning to what they do and who they are. This is extraordinary. Business information, sports information, information, as I indicated last night, about the wheels section of the Toronto Star, so you can survey or canvass on a weekly basis what is your best automobile purchase option. That gets significantly higher, and I mean significantly higher coverage, than does the fact that still the vast majority of Canadians, now he's limiting himself in some respects to Christian statistics. It becomes even larger when you look at Hindu and Muslim and even to some considerable degree Jewish as well, statistics of weekly worship practice. How did this happen? This large constituency has this specific component so largely unmeasured and underrepresented in the media. Well, that's the conundrum we face, and that's the kind of thing we're going to be looking at or trying to make some sense of during the course of these three lectures. And as I said to you yesterday, I'm not speaking to you as a statistician, because I am not one, nor as a social scientist, for I am not that either, nor a professor of journalism. I've never been to a journalism school. I'm an English professor, and I teach undergraduates and graduates and now work in the university administration, and I am an amateur journalist. But after 20 years in the field, in which I have covered pretty well all the media and continue to have a voice in all the media, these are the kinds of questions that I find disturbing, and I continue to find some kind of rationalization for. It's not easy. Let me go on now. In an interesting piece by Edward Stourton, I'm never quite sure how to pronounce his name, but I think it might be Stourton. Edward Stourton's piece in Charterhouse Chronicle in the Catholic Herald of London. He speaks about his BBC commission, quoting in the process Hugo Young. Hugo Young is the great political analyst in England who wrote the biography of Maggie Thatcher, and also alludes to Cardinal Martini. Martini, as you may know, is the quite influential biblical scholar and Cardinal Archbishop of Milan. Anyway, let me set the context here. Starton is a BBC veteran, an established reporter, with whose credentials in terms of broadcasting are unassailable. In a very interesting article in a section of the Catholic Herald called the Charterhouse Chronicle, this is a weekly bit of the paper, he reflects on the fact that the BBC has just now commissioned him to undertake a major work, multi-hour series on Roman Catholicism. Okay? And this is what he observes. And I found this really interesting. He's engaged in this work right now. He says, "For years, I have been living a hypocritical lie, or at the very least, a comfortable fib. I am about to be rumbled. The BBC has asked me to work on a series of programs about the modern Catholic Church. On the face of it, it is a dream invitation. It is the kind of project at which the BBC excels. We will have the time and the resources to do the job properly, and the producers chosen for the task are both talented and thoughtful. This will be to religious broadcasting in my mind what Pride and Prejudice and Middlemarch were to costume drama. And it will influence the way millions of people think about the church. The potential worldwide audience is huge, and even in fin de siècle, Britain, religion is endlessly debated, as we indicated last night. Wherever two or three are gathered together in the name of a pint, I was going to say print, but of a pint. It is not often I am offered money to study a subject I find fascinating with the opportunity of some covert evangelizing on the side." The distinguished political columnist Hugo Young, who is actually a member of the Board of Trustees of the Tablet, the Catholic publication in London, put the point neatly in a lecture to mark the centenary of Westminster Cathedral last year. He said, and I quote, "There is a sense in which religious truth is forever alien to the deconstructive procedures of modern journalism. Religious truth is about otherness. It is about mystery, and these are impalpable. God and God's interpreters are not properly susceptible to the reductivist simplicities of the Daily Mail." End of quote. But the Church, argues Starton, surely has no need to feel what Cardinal Martini once called an inferiority complex before the great secular press or television or radio. As an institution, it is more international than CNN, and even more ancient and venerable than the BBC, and that says some. But more importantly, the truth on which it is founded dwarfs all the scoops in all the panoramas and world in action programs ever made. Well, there's a slight note of triumphalism in Starton's review, a bit of pious piffle indeed, but he's also sharply critical about what indeed, and significantly hopeful of what can be executed in a commission that allows him to look at something even more important than the BBC. If networks were to think of religion in slightly more humble terms like Starton, if they were to see their networks in relation to structures and realities larger than their own limited historical memory, they might be struck by the fact that indeed something as vast as Christianity, or as Islam, or Judaism, is indeed open to a serious critique and review and presentation. It is to so persuade them, however, that we have the greatest difficulty. A reminder, the BBC, of course, is in fact public broadcasting. Now, what do we do with the CBC, and what happens in Canada? Certainly we have seen over many years that the CBC's Man Alive program continues to survive, against quite considerable odds, by the way. Ever since Roy Bonesteel left as its host or anchor, you will notice there have been several replacements. Thompson, currently R.H. Thompson, Kent, Arthur Kent, they didn't seem to know quite what to do with him, so they gave him the Man Alive beat. Before him was a host that was subsequently booted off to a radio program in Montreal. I've just forgotten his name right now. Peter Downing, exactly. And they're all really competent hosts. I've worked with Downing and Bonesteel in particular and know how searching they can be, how clever, how penetrating their insights. But the program rarely has the stamp of Roy Bonesteel. We've all been brought up to the sounds of his deeply mellifluous voice. We all know his careful and soothing presence on TV. And many of you may have, in fact, encountered him in recent years in his post-Man Alive phase as he travels the country supporting particular causes, most specifically inter pares, but other groups as well. He's also written about his Man Alive experience. Man Alive was one of the most watched programs in the country. And even in its slightly more reduced or truncated version, it still enjoys a significant viewership. Why? Well, it's one of the few places on North American television screens where you actually can get, for 20, 25, or 20 minutes of airing time, the treatment of a subject, sometimes very specifically religious, sometimes more nebulously so, but all falling within that larger rubric of ultimate meaning. That this is a program that takes seriously things other than the latest political scam, the latest crisis or scandal, the latest dramatic investigation, all of which are newsworthy and all of which should be covered. There's no argument against this. But somehow these special moments, the moments of the Spirit, are neglected. Man Alive doesn't neglect it, even in its significantly reduced programming format. Vision TV, which enjoys again a slightly hybrid status as partly public television but partly private broadcasting as well, it is in fact niche or private broadcasting in the full sense of the term, is a multi-faith station. It's also present, I know, here in Atlantic Canada. The care, the earnestness, and the sincerity brought to the execution of its mandate is remarkable by any standard. And it is very interesting to see in the writing of John Hazlitt-Cuff, who is the media columnist for the Globe and Mail, a most cynical and acerbic individual, if ever there was one, has a special place in his heart for Vision TV. He can be quite scathing in his review of various and several programs, some of which almost have iconic status in certain journalistic circles. He brings his sharp tongue or his sharp pen to bear without mercy. But when it comes to Vision TV, rare is any kind of negative criticism. Now, Cuff would be hard-pressed to define himself in any sense as a man of faith. But he's clearly a man, an individual, searching, eager to understand, not satisfied with the pap he receives, or indeed, he is required to deliver. So he finds in Vision TV a kind of antidote to the darkening landscape in a way. It's perhaps not sufficient in the long run, but it does tell you something, that even the most sharp and skeptical of secular journalists can find in conviction television, I find that term rather awkward, but I use it nonetheless, something of significant consequence. The growth in niche broadcasting and the fact that we have emerging separate networks like the Crossroads television system is a fine indication, but to me an alarming one at the same time, as I may have slightly alluded to last night, of the increasing marginalization or peripheralization of religion as a subject worthy of television investigation. In short, what I'm saying is that creed-driven religious broadcasters, and again I don't wish this to be negatively interpreted, who purchased time on a network are not engaged in the kind of coverage of religious themes and, quotation marks, religious broadcasting that I am concerned with. They have their role, they have their niche, they're available on cable system, they have a purpose, fair game. There's no particular reason why they shouldn't be present as well. I do lament, however, the fact that a number of critics, and I think indeed a number of viewers, tend to think that if you look at the Vision station or Crossroads television or one of the tele-evangelist bought or purchased programs on a weekday morning or late in the evening around the time of infotainment, that somehow or other that is religious broadcasting, insult us. That is not religious broadcasting. That's broadcasting, certainly, of religious material. It is broadcasting driven by strong conviction and it's broadcasting that's worthy of a place on the network. But to somehow suggest that that covers religion in the media is to diminish it significantly. Let me go on. Let me give you an example of where we can find genuine, searching religious broadcasting. They're always in places we least expect to find them. One example. The Discovery Channel, do we get Discovery here in Halifax? Okay, good. So it's now national. The Discovery station, which is 80% owned by Canadians and 20% owned by the Disney Channel, is very interesting. It's a science-based, science inquiry television program, people like Jay Ingram, of course. Now, they put together a series last year that took several months, and I don't know if any of you saw them. They were variously interesting. A series of programs on the Discovery Channels.ca. It's the 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock in the evening weekly program, and I think they replay it later in the evening. And it's a kind of a science roundup for the day. Well, they introduced what they call Discovery's 2020 Vision, which was a 20-minute slot every alternate week in the program. And that 2020 slot was the recreation through Rob Sawyer, the science fiction writer, rather distinguished science fiction writer actually, of a scenario of about 8 minutes in which a new issue arose as a consequence of emerging science. And so you moved forward to the year 2020. So it was a clever play on 2020, but it was also the year 2020. And he broadcast back from the year 2020 to the Discovery Studios in Toronto in the current year 1998. And then there was a panel afterwards that dealt with this scenario. And you'd have various things. Now, it was interesting. I can talk about this person because I was on the panel. And I can remember receiving the phone call from the producer, Bennett Schaub, asking me to sit on this panel. And I said, well, good grief, I have no background in science. I'll make a fool of myself. What could I possibly say? He said, well, that's exactly what we want you to do. I said, that may be some comfort to my critics and indeed my children, but no. I don't intend to get on TV and make a fool of myself. He said, no, what we want is we want one person on the panel who can give a humanistic perspective on some of these scientific discoveries and advances and ethical quandaries who doesn't come from the sciences per se. I said, well, put it in that way, let's give it a try. So I was on the panel discussion with a scientist, a computer scientist from the University of Western Ontario, Keith Dudney, quite a remarkable man who is now actually working more in the area of ecology than computer science. He's taken early retirement, but a remarkable scientist by any yardstick. A woman, Dr. Pauline Mazumdar, who's a professor of medicine, but she's also a professor of the history of medicine, who teaches at the Institute for the History of Technology in the Graduate Center of the University of Toronto. And so she has 2 doctorates, one in medical science and one in the history of science from Johns Hopkins. And Jay Ingram, the former host of Quirks and Quarks, and now the host of this Discovery Channel program, and a man of really estimable intelligence, exactly the kind of writer working in the area of the popular media who makes science accessible and intelligible for lay people like myself. Then me, and then the science fiction writer Rob Sawyer. Every single one of the scenarios he wrote involved an ethical issue of significant proportion and indeed religious implications. In fact, the religious implications couldn't be avoided, nor did he attempt to erase them. For instance, the opening program was about male pregnancy. All of these programs, by the way, are based on the fact that within 20 or 25 years, all of these will be not only a scientific reality, but in fact a current practice. They anticipate that, in fact, within 8 years, males will be able to carry embryos to term, and there are particular ways in which surgically this can be adjusted. What are the social, moral, and anthropological quandaries associated with male pregnancy? Well, it certainly upsets the domestic balance and adds an altogether new note to the going to work scenario in the morning. And certainly on several grounds, in spite of the fact the initial reaction of everybody is incredulity, the professor of medicine and historian made it very clear that this is the most likely the immediate discovery on the immediate horizon. We then went on to talk about all kinds of other things, replication of the DNA particle and whatnot. One of the interesting scenarios they had was, what if they uncovered, or they discovered indeed, that the shroud of Turin was indeed the shroud that covered Jesus, and they could do this by establishing the DNA. And through the DNA subsequent replication, they could, in fact, through significant generations of cloning, recreate Jesus. Okay, so we have a new take on the second coming. Now this is really alarming. The scientists on the panel had much more fun with this than I did, okay, as I tried to make sense of this by any category of classical understanding. What was clear in the programs we worked on for the whole year, they're now over at the end of about May or something like that, was the fascinating dialogue that went on. The fact that the Discovery Channel was prepared to say, yes, religion matters in more ways than just simply sitting down wondering if you're going to be touched by the wing of an angel, or whether you want to join in an annual Christmas fest with Mitch Miller and watch the bouncing ball, or whether, in fact, religion does matter in terms of human self-definition and destiny. And the scientists, the producers, the science fiction writer was saying, indubitably, in short, all these issues, whether regarding, in the most frivolous way, serious nonetheless, male pregnancy, to the potential replication or possible replication of Jesus' DNA particles, or particle, pattern, what they were saying was religion has a significant voice, indeed perhaps the most critical, in all of these discussions. That was one indication to me at least, that in both commercial and in public broadcasting, if producers are prepared to take the risk, it can pay off. Now, for just a few minutes, I want to show you something here in terms of a documentary. To give you some idea of what we tried to do, it was for commercial television, but it was driven by an independent producer's effort to understand one of the great mysteries of the universe, the Vatican. So John McGreevy, who is the producer of the series, got together a consulting team. I was the chief consultant for the series. And we had Peter Hebblethwaite, the very distinguished papal biographer, Jennifer Arcon, who had just completed a doctorate at one of the pontifical universities and whose husband was the Canadian ambassador to the Holy See, and one other person from Paris, and myself. Interestingly enough, half of the consultants team died before the first program went to air. One of the more unnerving projects I've ever been associated with. And every time I bring the program or show it, I have since kept in mind the cautionary tale itself, that I may be next on the list. But what we did with this series, it was a 6-hour series, and what McGreevy wanted to do was he wanted to get it fronted by an international name. Okay, so where do you go? And who is perhaps the most elegant of international names? Well, Sir Peter Ustinov. And so Sir Peter's inside the Vatican it becomes. Okay. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever had the opportunity of meeting Ustinov, or indeed if ever had the opportunity to work with him, but he writes his own scripts. He has that grand, cavalier disregard for fact that old actors seem to have. So he just invents it. And I can remember one particular scene, and it's not irrelevant here because it precedes some of what happens in this short section I'm going to show you. We're going down the Tiber, and Sir Peter is in a boat going down the Tiber. And Sir Peter is acquiring the kind of gargantuan girth that Orson Welles had in his later years. So the boat is none too secure. So they're going down the Tiber, they're shooting it, and he gets one of the facts wrong. When the Russians come back to Toronto, I'm looking at the Russians because I'm the consultant, chief consultant, and I say, well, no, that can't happen. What he says about the Roman question at this point, this is the question around the great discussion of the creation of the Vatican City State between the fascist government and Cardinal Gaspari, isn't true. It's just not true. I mean, it's not a big egregious there. It's not true. And there are a couple of other minor points. The producer looked at me incredulously and said, what are you saying to me? We should reshoot? And I said, well, the alternative is to be inaccurate. He says, the alternative is $20,000 an hour. We go with the inaccuracy. there are little minor points that run through the series that are inaccurate because economics dictates you don't reshoot Peter Ustinov going down the Tiber, regardless, simply because it's going to cost more than perhaps the fact that maybe 1/1,000,000th of a person or percentile will get the fact that it's wrong, will notice that it's wrong. Economics drives even the most altruistic documentarists. Anyway, Sir Peter, the part I'm going to show you here is that John McGreevy decided, and it is arguable whether it works as a dramatic or a documentary technique. You can make your own judgment on it. But he decided that he wanted to recreate dramatically certain significant moments in the history of the Vatican, and that he was going to do this by recruiting professional actors, and that he would play kind of historical games, a certain form of legerdemain, kind of, McGreevy is a bit of a prestidigitator, and he decided what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and have Peter Ustinov interview Martin Luther, in German, of course, 16th century German. I'm going to have him talk to Catherine of Siena, 14th or 15th century Italian. I'm going to have him talk to Constantine. I'm going to have him talk to Pope Gregory I. And that's what he does. Some critics thought it worked brilliantly. Some thought it was too theatrical and it failed. Nonetheless, the final one is this marvelous interview with Pietro Cardinal-Gaspari, the Secretary of State. Now, it is not Cardinal-Gaspari. It's one of Italy's most distinguished actors who plays the role. But what he does is he recreates the scene. And so the documentary, which is ostensibly about a religious subject, the Vatican, in fact employs every cinematic and documentary technique possible, knowing, as we discussed last night, that it is at the level of narrative that the media will engage the viewer or listener. And in this, McGreevy is a master. The section I want to show you then deals with Sir Peter moving in to talk to Cardinal-Gaspari about the resolution of what is called the Roman question. Finally happened with the Lateran Treaty of 1929, when the fascist state of Italy, in fact, with the Vatican, not have been able to see the subtitles. This is what we don't have larger VCR screens, and McGreevy had attempted, in his attempt to establish historical verisimilitude, wanted to make sure that whoever Sir Peter's interlocutor was would speak his native language. Now, the wonderful thing about that is, of course, it does establish exactly that, a sense of historical verisimilitude. The problem is you need somebody like Sir Peter Ustinov to be able to do it. As a multilinguist, he was able to actually conduct these interviews in precisely the way you see. It was not staged several times. He just went in quite comfortably, worked with the actor, did an initial rehearsal, and then followed through with the script. Of course, as I indicated, he had a somewhat cavalier attitude toward the script sometimes and inserted his own observations. That seems to me, in an important way, that, by the way, that was co-produced by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and went all over the world, picked up even by Russian television, Chinese television, and several other networks. Now, it's religious broadcasting of a kind. It deals specifically with an institution of religious reality. In some of the other programs, it looked more specifically at some of the concerns of people like Catherine of Siena, Francesco Bernardoni, and whatnot. It also bore the very personal stamp of the producer and indeed of the host. And the writers had to work their way around it. In fact, I can remember a couple of instances when we wondered what the heck this had to do with the Vatican. At one point, half of one program was shot in Istanbul. Right? And I remember saying to the producer, I said, writing the script around and working this around is something else. Gary Michael Dolt, by the way, who is an art critic, was the principal writer of the series. Why are we in Istanbul? Well, ostensibly to talk about Justinian and Theodora and to talk about Hagia Sophia and all this kind of stuff. In fact, it's because Istanbul is one of Sir Peter's favorite spots. That's where he went. So went off to Ravenna doing the same thing, looking at the mosaics of Justinian, because happens to be what Sir Peter likes. So there's a bit of the personal stamp, bit travelogue, good deal of religion and history. But it was designed as, again, I think as I hope I'm demonstrating, it's concerned with the narrative. It has to engage you at some particular level. Since then, Eamon Duffy the distinguished ecclesiastical historian at Cambridge, has come out with a BBC series called Saints and Sinners that was broadcast throughout North America, dealing again with the history of the papacy. Much more estimable in terms of its historical accuracy, it is a series that does not have a personal stamp or signature and is in fact straight history. I watched the series, read the text, it's wonderful stuff, but it doesn't engage at the level of narrative. And I think it's a very different series and with a much reduced popular appeal than McGreevy's Inside the Vatican with Peter Ustinov. It does indicate yet once again, however, that religion as a topic is marketable. Now, in this particular instance, it was the Vatican, but it could be others as well. What constitutes then religious television? Bible-thumping televangelists, televised mass, pious biographies, panel discussions with an attitude, albeit a religious attitude, documentaries of dubious intellectual integrity and minimal production value, because we have a great number of those. Or is it religious entertainment a la Hollywood, something like Nothing Sacred or Touched by an Angel or its derivatives? Or indeed the BBC's celebrated and notorious Father Ted, which would appear to have a religious subject matter, if only to, in a Python-esque way, eviscerate religious life. Or, strangely enough, in a BBC series like This Life. I don't know if you had a chance to see this. It was picked up by TV Ontario. And it is a very interesting series of about 18 or 20 parts about a group of lawyers, young lawyers in London, trying to make a living. On the surface, it is about their sexual escapades, their career ambitions, the complications that enter into their emotional lives as they struggle to find their identity as young lawyers, the plotting, the conniving, the backstabbing, the humor. It's pretty raunchy in its way. Only the British could actually have it on primetime television. It's irreverent in other ways. It's entirely narcissistic. All the principles exist only for themselves. What love or affection you see always seems to be carefully calibrated in terms of self-interest. Everything is, in the postmodern manner, entirely self-referential. The series is a careful cocoon of emotion and ambition. And religion, when it does exist, is again not only on the peripheral, it is in fact risible. At one point, one of the lawyers is going off to serve elsewhere. He's been involved in some kind of criminal activities, which is really not criminal. It was just, in fact, illegal. And he got himself in quite a quandary, and he, in fact, leaves the country for a period of time. And so they're advertising to replace their mate. And they're both men and women. And when they're sitting down working how they're going to design the advert that would appear in the newspaper, one of them says, just make sure you say, here's what we would like, and what we would not like, we don't want a Christian. Okay? So this advert's going to appear in the newspapers, and one of the things they're going to say is we don't want a Christian. And then it becomes clear why they don't want a Christian. Because a Christian, in their eyes, represents everything that we've come to understand about Victorian repression, kind of fundamentalistic attitude toward the world and toward pleasure, which is censorious and delimiting. In other words, it's Christian as Victorian stereotype, and there's precious little truth to it. Now, that's the superficial reading of the series. In fact, a careful reading of the series shows you, again and again, that the quandary they find themselves in, the moral vacuum that defines their life, is a result of spiritual emptiness. There's no preaching here. The producers make no case that this is, in fact, look at this damnable collection of narcissists. They never say that. They're always treated somewhat sympathetically. We can empathize with some of the problems that they have. I think we balk at their easy morality, as it were, in their human relations. and the sometimes glib way in which they look at what we would perceive as grave issues. But we admire their youth. We're attracted by the kind of free-for-all and unrestricted way in which they cross class barriers and everything else. Again, it is very much a British series. But it is very clear to me that the writers have a strong religious or moral edge that runs through entire, because never is it made attractive. It's never attractive. What we might consider, using more traditional language, dissolute living, becomes, in the craft of the writers, empty living, but the result's the same. I don't know if the series has been shown here, but if it does, or if it ever appears, make a point of watching it. Some of it's distasteful. Ultimately, it's entirely engaging. It's the narrative of lives fractured. And underneath it all, ever so subtly, a kind of clear religious vision emerges. I think you find that even more blatantly in some recent American television programming. I think, and this you may find shocking, that the most powerful, pointed, poignant religious broadcasting that's going on right now is going on Showcase Television, that picked up from HBO in the United States, because the American networks would simply not air it, of Tom Fontana's devastating series called Oz, about the Oswald maximum security prison. Okay? Now this is a series, the sexuality, the violence is so graphic that it's accompanied by civil warnings. As I say, no American commercial network would pick up the series. In Canada, it's been picked up by Showcase, and they've already moved into their second allotment now, I think another 8 or 10 programs. It's set in a maximum security prison called, which the inmates call Oz or Emerald City, and I think you can get the literary allusion. Now you think on the surface of this, how could this possibly be religious broadcasting? Good God, you have a prison of incarcerated men, and the violence is really quite unspeakable. And it's relentless. For the 60 uninterrupted minutes of pulsating anxiety and mounting tension, cumulative to a sometimes inhuman degree, one encounters what it must like to live in this concentrated hell of punishment. The two protagonists, if you like to use traditional language, or heroes, are the religious. A nun, who's a psychologist, who's in fact modeled on the writer's sister, who's a nun. Tom Fontana's sister is a nun. And the priest chaplain, who's a recently ordained American Vietnamese cleric, and this is his first assignment. Now this nun and this priest are raw flesh and blood witnesses of the gospel. There is no piety here. All the stereotyping has been stripped away. They are not frauds, no great exposés or disclosures of naughty, behind-the-thing, underside kinds of things we expect clerics to do. None of that. This is not cloying piety, nor is it hard copy exposé. What it is carefully articulated, deeply realized or executed character. Now, Fontana himself, I've watched the series. I found it extremely difficult to watch. This is not television as entertainment. It's very unsettling. And I had no sense that it was going to be like this, or that this religious theme was going to be dominant. And then I began to think, am I reading into this? Is this me sitting back and saying, okay, this is Fontana giving it this kind of religious edge? Now, he's got it, in some respects, obliquely present. In other instances, he hits you in the face with it. Okay? The language is rough, but also artfully created. The whole thing rings distressingly true of prison life. And of course, the prison is also a metaphor for other things. It's really about society and moral values. And then I discovered an interview that he had in which he says the following. And it was kind of gratifying to think that in fact, at least as far as this is concerned, I didn't get it wrong. Fontana says, this is Fontana, the producer and the writer, says, God has a large part in Oz, although you'd think it was a godless place. I do a lot of religious themes in all my work. His other famous series actually aired on commercial television was a series called Homicide, which I've never seen, but you may have. Fontana, in fact, says that Sister Pete, the psychologist who works with these men in their hell, is based on his own sister, who's also a nun. By differentiating between the characters, argues Fontana, how each of them believes or doesn't believe in God, it helps me to write scenes because it defines them individually. It helps me to make the character more dimensional. So it isn't wishful thinking. It is indeed true. It's an arresting observation at first to think that the most effective dramatic series on television, and most potent in every regard, is at heart a religious series. Most would be shocked at any kind of understanding. If the series would have advertised itself amongst producers or agents and saying, come and see the most powerful religious series could be aired this year, they would have been laughed out of the producer's room. But that's what it's informed by. This critical, searching, moral and religious sensibility. Fontana doesn't apologize for it. He has it in your face if you can see it. Now, just to show you that this is not unique to the United States, the most effective religious programming in a dramatic series that is done in England is done by Jimmy McGovern. Now, some of you may remember Jimmy McGovern is the author of a rather controversial film that actually originated again as a BBC program called Priest. Actually, the producer for the series and the director of the series was Antonia Bird, an Anglican. But the program is called Priest, caused a great deal of controversy throughout North America when it was released. Although it was very interesting, I attended a special opening of it in Toronto for bishops and for priests, and for priests working with priests, people like, priests from the Avalon Foundation, Southdown in Northern Ontario, Northern Toronto, and places like that. And they all loved it. Well, love isn't quite the right word, but they thought it rang true. Okay. Now, the larger Catholic reaction, particularly amongst many lay Catholics, was quite the contrary, interestingly enough. And in the United States, it was actually banned by various organizations. No, not by the American hierarchy, interestingly. Regardless, whatever one may think of the film Priest, McGovern's principal religious work isn't in that. It's in his other work, which has a much larger commercial base. Cracker. Anyone ever seen the series Cracker? About a psychiatrist, about a forensic psychiatrist, okay, in the north, Manchester, I think, or Liverpool, one of the northern cities. Maybe it's Manchester. And Cracker is the story of this forensic psychiatrist and the mess of his life. I mean, he's involved in really instances of deep and complicated cruelty, and he penetrates, or probes, I should say. He probes the depths of the human heart on a regular basis, clinically. Yet his own heart is a mess. The depths of his own life, he's skewered by his own failure to make proper decisions. His life is more a moral mess than his patients and clients. And he's brought in, you are brought into Cracker's universe, which is a universe fractured. Now, in every regard, it impinges upon his own Catholic upbringing, his lapsed Catholicism, his relationship with his brother, the role that a local priest plays in the struggles of conscience, because as a psychiatrist and also as an individual having an affair, struggling to accept his son, involved in a love-hate relationship with his wife because he loathes himself. McGovern again and again never allows the religious theme to leave the surface, to leave the screen. It's there at every point, oblique, sometimes minimally eclipsed or eclipsed for a short time, only to come back with force. In the most recent series done, 5-hour series, aired in Canada only by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, called The Lakes. Anyone see that? I don't know. It was a 5-hour program, the best television I've seen in a decade. Absolutely unsettling. The protagonist of the 5-hour series is the priest, the parish priest. He's no Father Ted. He's not Bing Crosby, Father O'Malley. He's flesh, blood, real, desperate, faith-driven. The series is based around the experience of a young man who is a wastrel, who is an outsider. He has no acceptance by his peers to some degree, but certainly by his parents and others. He finds some modicum of love. He moves north after he's been jailed for a short time with his recent wife and child, whom he desperately loves. He can't find his way. He moves north, gets a job in a boathouse, okay? And on one particular occasion, these children, these school children, out on the boat in Lake Windermere, hence the lakes, the boat tips over because of a sonic boom of a flying aircraft, and they drown. They all drown. The death of those children unravels the society. That whole village and all the relations come unhinged because of it. But those 5 hours of gripping television deal with redemption, not unremitting evil. They deal with a reconciliation, even if it is only compromise forgiveness. They deal, through the priest, with the need for healing. The central symbol is the Eucharist. Through the 5 hours. Through the 5 hours, the central symbol is the Eucharist. This is BBC. In a country that in many ways sees itself de-Christianized. It's superb drama. It's unrelenting. And if anyone were to say, where do you look for religious broadcasting? And you would say, Jimmy McGovern's The Lakes. They look at you aghast. Are you mad? But believe me in this. Let me conclude now, because we've gone on quite long and you've been wonderfully patient, by just simply saying that the difficulty of getting, however, something like The Lakes on commercial network in North America, in spite of the success of Oz, but Oz, as I said already, is not on the commercial networks in the US, was brought home to me very powerfully a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, when I was hired to serve as the consultant for the film version of the life, well, it's not really, but a film version of a work called Mariette in Ecstasy by a brilliant novelist in the United States by the name of Ron Hansen. John Bailey was shooting it. Hollywood would not give them the support for the film. The film is based on the life of a stigmatic in northern Quebec, northern Ontario, New York, near the Quebec border, and at the turn of the century, in a fictitious order. In fact, it is based on the life of Thérèse Martin. It is the life of Thérèse de Lisieux, all right? But it's transported to the United States, and it's made into an exquisitely evocative story of the interplay, dangerous interplay of mysticism and eroticism, okay? Written by a writer of compelling skill and lyricism. Hollywood wouldn't fund it, but they got superb actors, just superb. Eva Marie Saint played the Mother Superior. Rutger Hauer, the distinguished international actor, played the modernist priest, confessor who's caught up in it. Jennifer Arau was going to play Mariette, the young novice who goes through all of this, the kind of Thérèse figure. Hollywood's view of religion, however, and spirituality eventually prevailed over the Ron Hansen and John Bailey work. Hollywood favored ambiguity and relished the tension, Bailey and Hansen, the combined team, because the novelist also served as a screenwriter, favored ambiguity and relished the tension that exists between sexuality and mysticism. Hollywood didn't. In the end, Hollywood alone determines how spirituality will be sold to the public. The film was disowned. The film has never been shown. Thank you. Now, I've kept you, as I say, for far too long, and I apologize for that. I should have edited the television segment. Anyway, are there questions or comments about what I've spoken about this morning? As I say, what I will look at later on is the print one. Yes? Oh, good. Thank you.
I have a 19-year-old son who's graduated from Coal Harbor High, which is an anomaly across the nation these days. A comment I can make, something you said the other night when you were talking about Thomas Merton. One of the things that arose among all the, and I will say students suffering as well as teachers suffering, was the presence of God, I would say. And the different religions joined together unofficially to support the kids through the school. Anyway, the thing that struck me is when you talked about Fontana and that program about the prison, and I had the same reaction as you. And actually, probably, since the 19-year-old's been 13, I've been going through culture shock in our family. And they were brought up the same as all the others, Catholic and some intellectual there as well as the fundamentals. And my 19-year-old is always surprising me. And he made me sit through a couple of those programs. Some of it I could stay the whole time, some of it I had to get up and leave. But I see what you're saying. And the thought had occurred to me when I first knew you were coming. How often do you find that the youth are listening to any kind of, I don't say religion, I'd say more presence of God in their lives is coming across the media? Because I know we only have 9% of them going to church. Some of them are getting it in the families, but I feel personally they're not getting what they should even in the church off the altar. We have in this city a fantastic youth group that has mushroomed within a year. And the hunger is there. I guess what I'm saying is that I felt for a long time you get the right people, and if they have the guts, they can get this across to the young people, because if nothing else, young people watch TV. And, well, I guess your comments on that.
Well, you've raised several good points, I think, several good points. I think that I'm amazed and pleased to hear that in many respects it was your son that asked you to sit down and to watch the program, and I can certainly share with you that your discomfiture in sitting through some of the Oz segments. The drama is gripping, and you sometimes watch it against your better judgment or against your will. I think the fact that he sensed in this that this is a raw drama dealing with the fundamental issues of life and meaning is an indication of a genuine religious search, and the fact that he has understood what Fontana is doing here. And in a way, Fontana, I think, as does McGovern, understands that if you're going to articulate a religious or moral vision in your art, you're not going to be able to articulate it in any credible way if you identify it as such. That, in other words, it's going to have to be disguised. It's going to have to come to them obliquely, subtly, behind the scenes, as it were. I mean, if you were to say, certainly if I were to say to my children, let's gather together around the TV set and watch some religious broadcasting, they would probably have me committed. They would just simply, they'd look at me incredulous, like, I mean, is this a joke or what? So I think in an important way, and I felt this for some time, that for a number of people, the point of connection with religion in their lives now is going to be increasingly through art. It's going to be increasingly through novels and poems in the media than it is indeed going to be through institution of religion. Now, this may be, in fact, just an historical blip. It just may be a kind of fallow time for institutional religion in this postmodern era. And there were other trends and movements and cyclical forces will come into play at a later time. Who's to know and who's to judge? There can be no doubt, however, I think, that the official voice of the churches, and indeed the official face of institutional religion, whether it's Judaism or whatever, doesn't enjoy the greatest credibility. And very often, people come to understand, I see this often, very often, in discussions that I have with some of my colleagues in the English department who are Jewish, who remind me again and again that students in university are coming to an appreciation of the Jewish heritage and the importance of Jewish spirituality because they are reading Jewish fiction writers. Not because they pick it up in shul, not because their parents insist that it's an important part of their generation to appropriate the Jewish tradition, but because somehow some writer, some poet, some artist communicated to them and sparked an interest in recovering the tradition, or for the first time, for many of them, being open to the tradition they did not know. So I think that people like McGovern and like Fontana are engaged in a deeply religious undertaking. And I think that they are conscious of this. And I think that they have strained relations with institutional religion. And I think that in their own lives they struggle with what it means. In those particular cases, and I've isolated Catholic artists in this instance, you could choose others, what it means to be Catholic. But I think they entertain no illusions that what they do as artists comes out of, is nurtured, and is, well, I wouldn't even say enriched, I would say defined by their core convictions. I found the same thing. I was in Australia for the first time in April, and I was there very specifically to interview two people. One, Morris R. West, you may remember, the Catholic novelist of years ago, who's still very much a Catholic novelist, and Thomas Keneally, the author of Schindler's List. And Keneally is great fun. Keneally is in his early 60s now, and he's gone back, he's given up on Los Angeles, moved back permanently to his place just outside of Sydney. He's always trotted out by the Australian bishops when they want a social justice statement. They always bring out Tom because everybody knows who he is and because he's really committed to Aboriginal causes, and he's a dyed-in-the-wool Republican, which I'm not. I'm a constitutional monarchist, so there was some point of disagreement between the two of us when he insisted that I found a Republican candidate. But anyway, we talked about all kinds of different things, and we were talking, and I said, I thought that Schindler's List was his greatest Catholic novel. And he sat back, and because he's written several. He sat back, he says, you know, you're right. I never thought of it that way. But in talking about themes of redemption, and looking at Oskar Schindler's fractured meaning and his ordinary heroism, and then he started talking in even more refined and specific language about other characterizations and themes in the novel. He said, you're right, it is my most Catholic novel, and it could only have been written by me. Now, he wasn't being arrogant there, but he was talking about the personal signature in that work, and talking about it in relation to his television work as well. And I think that again and again, if you find an artist, you're never going to find, if they're really genuinely artists, that they're ever going to be comfortable with any kind of authority, religious authority in particular. So you're not going to find them engaged in devout and pious fluff. They're not going to do that. If you're going to find the religious passion of a Tom Fontana, you're going to find it in Oz. If you're going to find the anguished Catholic genius of Jimmy McGovern, you're going to find it in the Lakes and in the Cracker series. You're not going to find it in a kind of isolated pious bile on a Sunday morning. As artists, they bring their religious conviction and their passion to bear through their ambivalence, through their struggle, and through the human narrative. I think that makes the best religious broadcasting, personally. That's my view. Yes?
I think I have a couple of points I wanted to raise, and you can kind of respond to them. One of them relates to the statistics you gave earlier on about the percentage of Canadians who seem to have a genuine and living religious faith, and that is not reflected in the media. And I'm wondering if that may have something to do with the proportion of people who are involved in the media who perhaps are at variance with the larger population. I think there was a University of Western Ontario study done about 15 years ago which looked at religious and political and social opinions of people in the media, found them very much uniform within the media community, and very much at variance with those of people in the country at large.
No, that's a very good point.
The other point, and maybe to make them both and you might respond to them, when you were talking about vision, public broadcasting, I think of Tapestry on CBC Radio and Vision Television, I have to say that for myself, I've tended to find them somewhat predictable, edgy only in the sense that I think we frequently refer to edgy or cutting edge drama or treatments of subjects, again, once they've been accepted at least by an intellectual elite in the country. What concerned me when you were talking about vision was the fact that you were referring to that as somewhat different from creed-based. You made a reference to sort of Bible-thumping fundamentalism. And I'm concerned that while your point that this is one kind of religious broadcasting and you don't want it to preclude the kind that you've been talking about, it seems to me that recent decisions of the CRTC to limit creed-based broadcasting, particularly on cable, is certainly something that needs to be questioned. I was wondering if you'd ever thought about that or examined that. In other words, there are people who perhaps would like to see some pious bios on Sunday morning. You seem to indicate that they should have the right to that. I'm not sure our government agrees.
No, that's right. Both of those questions are very good. Let me go to the first one off the bat. I think that generally we have concluded, and not unreasonably, and I'm aware of that Western Ontario report you were talking about, that the people who compose the media are often like-minded, and they operate out of the same kind of what Ambrosic would say, and I think quite reasonably, narrow and uncritically reflected liberal ethos. I think that that's true. But that's my experience in working with the CBC in particular, is that that is often only superficially true. I have found, now it may be, again, that it's just particular units in the CBC that I'm working with where there's a much deeper core of inquiry. But people like David Cayley, Bernie Lucht, Lister Sinclair, Richard Handler, that crowd with which I have, well, not daily commerce, certainly weekly commerce, are a group of people who don't easily subscribe to that liberal ethos, which is often dismissive or adversarial towards any kind of religious sentiment, as if somehow one is embarrassed by it. Certainly doesn't want to talk about it publicly. But but they may well be rare in the industry, and they may be, precisely because they're working in the kinds of programs that they do, they may be more the exception than the rule. Because there is undoubtedly true, when I've worked with Pamela Wallen and several others in providing commentaries and whatnot, before we go to air, Valerie Pringle, all these people, Ralph Ben-Murgy, I'm always stunned by what seems to me not sharp working intelligence. They don't seem to think about things very much. And it may be that it's the nature of the media. It may be that my time with them is always rushed in between the makeup room and then going on the set and then coming off. But rarely do you find, in my experience, searching questions about the matter that seem to reveal a working or inquiring intelligence. And I don't want this to sound in any way dismissive or condescending, but very often I get the impression many of them have just simply absorbed the prevailing views, the views at least defined by the liberal journalistic ethos that dominates the media. They're not self-critical, they're not reflective about it, they don't scrutinize their own motivations, they just accept it. And you certainly see that, and you certainly see it with the kind of media momentum or media energy peculiar more to television than radio public broadcasting, because that tends to work with the spontaneous and the easily acceptable in a facile kind of a way. Again and again, I'm just shocked that there's no depth. And then when you discover somebody where there is depth, like Alison Smith, or if you get a few actual moments with Pamela Wallen, and you discover, my God, there's something really working here, and she's going a little, when we did the series with the program on current papal papabile, it's going to be Cardinal Lorenzo, will we have a first black pope, and these kinds of questions. There was genuine interest on her part. It wasn't just newsworthy, like, what would this mean? What would it mean for the Roman Catholic Church in particular? And you could sense that. So I think in some respects the culture is uncritically absorbed. And the more thinking figures within that culture occasionally do in fact move beyond the superficial and the facile and scrutinize it. But it is still largely rare. And it may be because of that, and because of the kinds of people that go into the media and do so uncritically, that they automatically assume that religion is a narrow and constricting kind of phenomenon that conforms to their specious liberal notions, and so you don't move forward. You're quite right. It's a dialectic that you find there. It's a tension, I think, that can only be significantly relieved by the hiring of people going into broadcasting who have thought seriously about these issues and who don't see themselves as apologists particularly, but do see themselves as fair critics for whom religion is an important part in determining their life's values. I think the incorporation of that kind of searching figure, David Shatsky, for instance, who moved from CBC to Vision TV is an excellent example. There are many others that you can find in isolated pockets, and if we could begin to create that kind of fermentation, we could have the loss of this tight grip by this liberal ethos. So I take your point, and I think it's a valid one. On the second one, with regard to the CRTC and the importance of creed-based or conviction-based religious broadcasting, I think the CRTC has not often played fair with this. I think that it is going to be dragged fighting into this. I think it will be more fear of the dominance of this market by American televangelists that would eventually force them to make certain kinds of concessions. And I think it is again the problem, and it is for me a problem, perhaps rather different than the CRTC commissioners who will be looking at it from a slightly different perspective perhaps, that my worry is that it would increasingly narrow or marginalize religion, that it will make religion in fact a component of niche broadcasting. That's already a real danger on the broadcasting market right across the country, as you know, that as this happens, the public broadcasting system has a greater difficulty struggling to sustain itself. And so the CBC has to increasingly narrowly define itself over against these competing networks, so its mandate is specifically Canadian. As a consequence, Global TV plays its game before CRTC, where its Canadian content is pathetic, absolutely pathetic. And now as you try to force them to abide by the CRTC restrictions that require them now as a national network because of the recent merger, they're going to have to abide by this. So they play all kinds of games which are nothing much more than legal leisure domain as they try to avoid, in fact, the CRTC restrictions. So as what happens to Canadian broadcasting, I fear could happen to religious broadcasting, that eventually it will merge into, or rather be confined to a kind of a niche, which I think would be, in the long run, disastrous. But they're both very good questions. Thank you. You've had enough of me.